We are recording today's program, and it will be available on both CFC's website and the library's YouTube channel. Anyone who is registered for the program, I will send you a link once I have it live. How long it will take for that to happen is somewhat at the mercy of how well Microsoft is cooperating with me, but I will get it ready as quickly as I can. So with that, I will turn things over to Peggy to talk a little bit about CFC and introduce Matt.
Thanks, Sam. I'm really pleased to have all of you here again. I see a lot of familiar faces today. I think we have more people probably coming in, and we have a number of people on Zoom. We are so pleased to be able to offer these programs with the help of the library, or in conjunction with the library. Sam does a lot of work with getting all the electronics set up, and of course the registration. So we're not having to deal with that. We can just focus on content. So a couple of announcements this morning before we start our program. Let's see. So many of you know that on March 1st, we are starting the pre-orders for our native plant sale. And the site will be live from March 1st through April 4th. The sale itself, of course, is the first weekend in May. And Friday available for members, and then Saturday and Sunday open to the public. But you can do your pre-orders from March 1st through April 4th. And we have, interestingly, this is the 30th year of our native plant sale. So we have designed a new garden, 30 plants for 30 years, that you can buy as a special garden, or of course all the different plants that we keep trying to get from more than 200 species of native plants that we have available. Okay. Oh, I also wanted to announce, we can use more volunteers for the native plant sale. So any of you who are willing to help out, you don't have to be an expert, although I see some experts in the room, but we also need strong backs on the Monday of the plant sale. That would be April, I think, 28th, because that's when our trees and shrubs are delivered, and we need help with lifting those big pots off the trucks. But any other anybody that has any time to be able to sign up, you can sign up at CFC, or you can sign up through the Barrington Area Volunteer Network. I should get you what? Did everybody hear that? No, but okay. After March 1st, we can get going. So good. Next month, our community education program is going to be on native plants for shade. I'm going to do that presentation myself. That's been my life's work, basically. my own yard is an acre of woods, so I've had 30 years of practice of what kind of plants grow there. But I also grew up with a mother who's a plant ecologist, and we used to vacation in northern Minnesota, and I would learn all the native woodland plants up there. So we'll have that program next month. And that's March 15th, and we have the flyers out here about that as well. And then this week on Tuesday, we're collaborating, CFC and the library, doing the program on skies, but I don't have the details of it. Edith, do you want to talk about it? Okay.
Sorry. I brought this up to the desk with me so I would not forget, and then I walked away from it. So it is actually a three-way collaboration between the library, CFC, and Northwest Suburban Astronomers. We've tried to do this here at the library before, and the problem is that the only place to set up the telescopes is in the back parking lot, and there are really bright lights on the back parking lot, and we can get the lights turned off, but then you have people driving through where people are trying to look through telescopes. So with CFC acquiring Hill and Dale Preserve, that seems like the perfect solution. It's relatively easily located. If you don't know where it is, you can find it by looking in the library's directory. We do encourage you to please register for that. At this point, there are fairly cloudy skies forecast for Tuesday. Tom tells me there is a clear sky dance, so we'll see if that works. If not, we will email everyone and let them know. And we have a rescheduled date picked out, but we're not telling you yet because we're really hoping it's going to work out this week. But if you're at all interested, please register. And I think that was all I needed to say.
Thank you. And I'm pleased now to be able to introduce our speaker for today, Matt Hokanson. He is the owner of a native plant landscaping company called Woods to Wetlands, and a longtime restoration volunteer with CFC. And he may talk more about this, but interestingly, he also has been the originator of a program with Harper College teaching, contributing to their drone technology program and using the drones to help do some of the conservation observations at Hill and Dale, our new property. I don't know how many deer and owls, and I don't know what all they find out there. So I think I was going to ask whether Matt will tell you whether you can hold your questions till the end or whether he is willing to be interrupted in it. We are having this program on Zoom as well, and so we will try to pick up, for those of you on Zoom, we'll try to pick up your questions as we're. Are you not hearing me? Oh, okay. All right. Oh, Patty and Alicia have microphones for audience questions, so they'll be picked up on Zoom. Thank you. Okay. All right, Matt, we're pleased to have you join us today.
Thank you, Peggy. I really appreciate that introduction. As said, my name's Matt Hokanson. I'm on the board of directors with Citizens for Conservation, but I've also been a longtime volunteer in the Barrington community for 18 years. I started getting my restoration experience with the Spring Creek Stewards in Cook County. I once upon a time had a career path as an automotive mechanic. So as I spent my learning how to repair cars, it translated into repairing ecosystems. And so I changed my office from 2 lift posts and a toolbox, what I called my cubicle, to the best office in the world, as far as I'm concerned, is just being outside. So I have a background. I used to work for tallgrass restoration, spent many years working for the forest preserves of Cook County. And then about 7 years ago with my wife, started our own small business doing ecological restoration and native landscaping, and we call it Woods to Wetlands. So my expertise is really in ecology, botany, prescribed fire. Peggy mentioned a bit about drone technology. I'm really into photography, so there's a lot of different aspects that related to that. And so with that drone program with CFC and Harper College, we're doing a lot of really important survey and data collection using drones, giving students the opportunities to do real world experiences rather than the type of classroom learning that they're used to. And so it's a good opportunity for the students, plus they're also giving us some really important data for conservation work. And then I also do plant propagation as well. I've done quite a bit of that for the Native Seed Gardener program. So, but today you're here to learn and hear about gardening despite drought. So it's how to choose, plant, and maintain the best species for climate resilience. So being here as a member of Citizens for Conservation and talking about the best species, of course, I'm gonna beat the drum once and over again about native plants. And so how important those are to putting in gardens, especially when you're trying to build drought resilience. So to get started, drought is complex and occurs in a lot of different areas of the world. It heavily impacts economic development and human society. Droughts have been increasing in many recent years throughout our country. Sometimes you get these small droughts. You also get these mega droughts like are being seen out west. But according to the Illinois State Water Survey, Unfortunately, droughts are a common feature in the climates of Illinois, and we've had several severe droughts over the 115 years of climate data recording. So although precipitation patterns are complex, increased prolonged temperatures associated with climate change can lead to more prolonged droughts. So low humidity, high temperatures can exacerbate drought conditions. But to understand how to prepare for drought and how to manage home gardens and urban landscapes, it can be helpful to know what drought is and its potential impacts. So at its basic level, a drought is a lack of rainfall. But there's a sort of overarching term called meteorological drought, which refers to simply as increased dry weather conditions with a lack of precipitation and rainfall over a certain period of time. So it's usually not identified in terms of impacts, but just on the precipitation measured over weeks, months, or years. So it looks different depending on where you live. If you live in a desert, you can still experience a drought through prolonged lack of rainfall. So most gardeners can cope with this type of drought with just watering their plants at appropriate intervals, which can help reduce the impacts of dry conditions. So there's three sort of types of droughts that meteorological drought can lead to. One of them is agricultural drought. So this focuses on large-scale crops and can even impact small home vegetable gardens. It's defined by a negative water balance that can be related to both lack of rainfall and high temperatures that increase evaporative water stress on growing plants. So it occurs mainly in the growing season because that is when crops are actively growing and impacts are most noticeable. Often agricultural drought can occur even when there's no impacts to us because it is quite subtle. Most people don't see the impacts until months later when it becomes harvest season. So agricultural droughts are often related to flash droughts. Flash droughts are characterized by very rapid development or intensification over a short time frame, or by a lengthy dry spell coupled with very high temperatures. Crops are the first things affected because of their need for frequent watering. Then we have another term which is called hydrological drought. This is focused on water levels, which what you see is in reduced water in streams, lakes, aquifers, and reservoirs. This is something that us within the community, you can really see when it's happening. It's related to a shortage of water over periods of time to as short as a week. Agricultural drought is related to shortage over periods of time as short as a week or a month, but hydrological drought is something that happens over months and years. It's when the water table starts to drop so significantly that you can see it within the landscape. So you see the dropping streams, lakes, reservoir levels. One example we might have remembered in the, I'd say, early 90s was when the Mississippi River level even dropped so bad that it impacted crops. I'm gonna go back on that one. The next one is ecological drought, which focuses on natural habitats and its impacts. It's temporary, but yet significant, with a deficit in water availability that increases habitat's vulnerability to disturbances. So drought alters the ecological balance of woods, wetlands, and prairies, and can affect the vital services natural habitats provide, such as water purification and biodiversity. This causes an increase in tree mortality, shrinking aquifer habitats, and reduced vegetation. It often leads to long-term impacts, which you can see in the changing ecosystem in plant communities. More drought-resilient plants start taking over to other ones. So this can happen in small-term impacts or very long-term impacts over years. And then another type of drought that's not necessarily quite always related to meteorological drought is socioeconomic drought. It's focused on people, and it occurs when water shortage affects the supply and demand of economic goods such as food, timber, water, and energy. An example is one when you're damming a major river, and so it's leading to excess water in one area, and then people downstream are feeling those impacts of it. We see this out west with all the challenges and the water issues related to the Colorado River and who's available to that water and who owns it and who has the rights to it. So you see a lot of these issues out west especially. We don't really deal with it a lot here in the Midwest, fortunately. But it happens in a lot of third world developing countries. It's a problem worldwide. So I'm going to talk a little bit on the impacts on the ecological drought and its impacts on woodlands, wetlands, and prairies. So in woodlands, there's physiological stress and damage to trees. You often see the leaf wilting and curling, yellowing, browning of leaves. You see early leaf drop towards the end of the growing season. Severe or prolonged drought leads to the tree death and mortality, especially in young planted or shallow rooted tree species. A couple of examples are dogwood and redbud. It slows down the fruit production of certain tree species. Frequent drought and drier conditions favors more drought tolerant species, so you start seeing a shift in forest composition over time. So the plant communities might change in a way to, let's say you have when we're in ecology, there's different plant communities and gradients based on moisture levels. We have what's called dry mesic conditions, which is a moderate moisture level. And then it goes on to wet mesic, wet, and so on and so forth. And so these mesic woodlands or even mesic prairies might start exhibiting more examples and species that look like dry mesic or dry woodland conditions. So in Illinois, you can end up having drought conditions as deep as 20 to 60 inches, which can really impact the root systems of trees. Drought-stressed trees are more vulnerable to insects and outbreaks and diseases. So sometimes we have invasive insects like the emerald ash borer, but then there are also native ones like the two-line chestnut borer that normally feed on oaks but aren't harming to them. I will back up one moment as I did not touch on this. Peggy mentioned earlier, we'll save questions kind of to the end of the presentation. Since it's via Zoom and it's hard to kind of have those questions come up midway. Just to remind about that. But the two-line chestnut borer is normally feeds on oaks in our area and is native. But when a tree is under stress from drought, it's like a 1-2 punch. So the insects impacting it, the drought is impacting as well, and it can cause early tree mortality. And then there's an increase in wildfire risk because the reduced moisture increases the fuel load and really dries out the fuels in our woodlands. So when we do prescribed burns or wildfires, we take into account the fuel moisture content of different ecosystems and plant communities and the size of these fuels. So you have what are called fine fuels, or in the fire world, we call them like 1-hour fuels because they're like grasses and they hold very little moisture. They dry out very quickly in low humidity conditions, but then you have these 10-hour and 1-hour fuels, which you find in woodlands, which are the leaf litter, the logs, the other parts that as those dry out in significant drought conditions, that's when you can get significant wildfire increased risks. So there's a significant impacts on wetlands, especially in areas where, like the Midwest, where we've significantly altered our hydrology through human development. You've also got agricultural areas where you've put in drain tiles. So there's a lot of different ways that droughts can impact wetlands. Droughts severely affect Illinois wetlands by causing water levels to drop, leading to drying of ephemeral wetlands, reducing water permanence, and stressing native plants and wildlife habitats. These dry periods increase risk of fire as well, just like I mentioned with woodlands. They facilitate the spread of invasive species. There's a reduce of nutrient filtering capabilities, and it diminishes the wetlands' capacity to recharge groundwater. You have water loss, which lead to lower water levels in lakes, ponds, and streams, often causing shallow wetlands to shrink or dry up entirely. Prolonged drought can shift vegetation from freshwater-dependent species to more salt-tolerant or dry land species, and allowing invasive non-wetland species to move in. You sometimes see in natural areas that have not had their hydrology impacted by human development in years of when you get maybe, for an example, a wet mesic prairie or wetland. In some years you have there's root systems that are able to handle these shifts and changes in vegetation. So on a really dry year, you might see, let's say, a wet mesic prairie. But on a really wet year, it might actually exhibit conditions and look like a sedge meadow. So the plants themselves have deep roots and are in the ground themselves, but might not show themselves up until you get certain conditions. So they might both, especially in wetland and wet prairie conditions, you have kind of these plant communities that are both intermixed with each other, but then show up differently in different years. But of course, these prolonged periods of drought are going to show more naturally shifting things that aren't going to change over time as much. Wetlands, which act as natural sponges, become less effective at flood control during dry periods and filtering sediments and nutrients from water, which impact downstream water quality. There's impacts on wildlife, so the species that depend on consistent water levels for breeding and survival. The loss of water reduces habitat for fish, birds, and other wildlife. And there's increased vulnerability with the loss of federal protection for many Illinois wetlands. There's a lot of changes within the federal government impacting the way construction is done in wetlands and what are classified and what are protected. So there is also political pressure in what can impact our wetlands as well. In prairies, you can have problems with soil and water depletion. Droughts cause rapid declines in soil moisture and dropping water tables, reducing the water available for plants. Native perennial prairie plants with deep roots can survive droughts better than some other plants, but extreme conditions still force them into early dormancy, turning them brown and making them appear dead. And you also get that reduced reproductive output. There's less flowers, less seeds on the plants during drought conditions, even if the plant still survives the drought. And then again, more increased fire risk during these drought periods. And which also leads to invasive species risk. Because sometimes through the increase of fire or decrease of fire, which we see with human development as well, you can get problems with invasive species invading our plant communities. So what does this really mean for urban gardens and landscapes and people that are trying to do this type of work at home? So I kind of touched on kind of these ecological impacts, but a lot of people here, I'm sure in the room and on Zoom, are here to understand more about what they can do at home in their gardens. So now that we have a better idea of what drought is and how it can impact natural habitats, what can it do for you folks as gardeners and landscapers? So in an urban landscape, drought conditions does not mean there's no irrigation. It doesn't mean dry soil. It simply means there's a lack of natural rainfall. So as climate change prevails, droughts are anticipated to become more common. Although it helps to have native plants that require less additional water, it is suggested to focus on having a landscape that requires less additional water rather than having to rely on watering itself alone. A lack of irrigation and mulch guarantees a drought-stressed landscape regardless of the species collected. Fine roots and their hairs require water to function. Without significant soil water, plants will go dormant or die, particularly during establishment when you've planted young species in your garden. Plants that are drought tolerant can tolerate seasonal lack of rainfall, but they can't tolerate chronically dry soil conditions. So again, those small-term droughts over small periods of time, native plants can survive, but mega droughts put stress on almost any plants. So that's why you, as a home gardener, have the advantage over natural areas is you can supplement water during those periods of low rainfall. I think I lost my Zoom video. There we go. So one of the important things and ways you can help protect plants during drought conditions is making sure that the plants that you're planting and are keeping alive have well-established root systems.
Matt, it's not shared on Zoom. So escape.
Okay, a little bit of a technical difficulty.
Yeah, go there and share down at the bottom.
Sure.
And then you should be able. Perfect, thank you.
Sorry for the technical difficulty. So when planting, I skipped a slide. So root systems that are well established are able to withstand drought periods, even between waterings. And one way to help with that, especially when you're planting newly grown trees and shrubs, is that there's no barriers between the roots and the landscape soil system. So many times you're given these trees with containers or they're balled and burlapped. It's important to remove all of that when planting your trees. And then you can have issues with clay, different things within the soil that are barriers that you might have to remove. I did a planting job one time and would have never experienced this under just turf grass. Somebody had an old parking lot bed, so we started digging and found chunks of asphalt that some were pretty big that we took out of there. So obviously these are barriers for plants that you're trying to put in the ground. So just keep in mind all of these things that can prevent roots from being able to spread the way they want to create well-established root systems. You deal with that in urban landscaping when people are planting trees down in the city. They have very little root system. So there's key factors into knowing where to put the plants, how you can get them to have well-established roots. And even in those places where there's tight root spacing, there are tree species that do well. So when you're in these urban areas, like in downtown Chicago, one of the best trees is the thornless honey locust tree. So they do great in those conditions where they don't have a lot of root spacing. So one of the ways for helping establish root systems too is how you water the plants when they're being established. So a term you might see in gardening is to do what's called deep infrequent watering. It's watering to where you have the depth of water to reach all the root systems, but then periods without watering, so these roots actually grow deeper in search for water. So you're kind of doing a balance of watering, not just watering constantly, because then what you get are shallow root systems that are weak and not able to withstand drought, or especially with trees, you don't want these shallow roots because they can't withstand storm and windy conditions. So I've had really good experience at my house with just in the first year watering plants every few weeks. I don't even have to water them every day. It's different for everybody in every different garden. So everybody's property is going to be different, whether you've got a flat landscape, it could be high and dry. I luckily am on a very moderate topographical property with a shallow water table. So where I live in Streamwood likely used to be a wetland. So at least when I have plants growing, there's water table at least somewhat close to them. So what I experience might not be the same as what other people do. But as long as you don't get to the point of plants wilting, and even if they just start to wilt, they can recover very easily if you water them right away. Because the wilting is actually a cause of a lack of water pressure in the stems and the cells and the tissues of the plants. So while the plant is transpiring water from its roots up into the tissues, there's actually like water pressure holding it stiff and solid, just like a garden hose. And when there's not enough water, that's when you get that kind of wilting. A little bit of wilting is okay. When they start to curl and dry up, when you touch it and it wants to turn to powder, that's when you've gone a little too long without water. But just a little bit of wilting is okay, and just keep them watering enough to get them to have well-established root systems. Now, sometimes you might see this wilting on well-established plants. I see this sometimes in really hot, sunny, dry days in summer, even in plants I have in my rain garden, and I can actually sometimes see the standing water. But because the temperature and the humidity are so much, and the UV exposure to the suns, that the plant can't transpire water fast enough. Even though it's sitting in water, it's sucking up water so fast and transpiring in those summer conditions, they start to wilt. So I've seen this on Joe Pye weed in my garden, but then literally as soon as the sun goes down and the shade comes back and the temperature's cool, the plant just bounces right back. So it's amazing how plants can wilt, but then bounce back from it rather quickly. Irrigation is really important. Not having things in the environment that are barriers, like soil amendments. You don't want the weed fabric that people used to promote so long ago that you now see the internet just berating people for. And we've all probably experienced that moment when we want to plant gardens and you go down 3-4 inches and somebody's got that weed fabric there. Yeah, it's great temporarily, but soil, everything else blows in on top of it, and it doesn't prevent weeds much at all. When sometimes you're deciding to try to kill off turf grass, there's different ways of doing that. When you want to establish a garden, you might be using either herbicide. People might do a method called sheet mulching, where you just put cardboard and a few inches of mulch down on top of it, or do the black plastic or clear plastic method. The issue with that is you do not ever want to use those near trees, because you're not only going to stop them from getting the moisture they need, but you're going to suffocate them from oxygen as well. So there's always these factors you want to take into account when you want to make sure whatever you're watering, you want the water to get to the roots of the plants you're watering. You don't want anything in the way of that, most importantly. The amount of water you give these plants is really going to depend on the type of vegetation you're planting. So whether you're planting small perennial plants, shrubs, trees, the size of those roots that they're going to have is going to depend on how much water you give. So depending on the type of soil you have, whether it's sand, silty loam, or clay, the amount of water you give a plant is going to, so maybe like an inch of rainfall in moderate soil conditions might give you a depth of, say, 6 to 8 inches. So depending on how many inches of rainfall you see in the weather forecast or how much you water something with a garden hose is going to really depend on how deep that water goes, and how deep you want the water to be is going to depend on what you've planted, because of course anything with deeper roots needs more water. And of course, properly mulched soil helps too, to reduce soil temperatures during really hot temperatures in summer, but then it keeps the moisture content of soil there when you want it. And of course, properly mulched areas are important, and we may have all seen and heard people use the term volcano mulching. So you don't want that mulch piled up on a tree up against the trunk of the tree, because important, that can actually suffocate the tree from getting oxygen. It can create too much moisture, which will cause decay. So as long as you can see the trunk of a tree when you mulch it in the what they call a donut way, I'm thinking now maybe I should have included also a regular picture of what it should look like. But most importantly, you want to see the full trunk of the tree, and especially just a little bit of root flare at the bottom. And sometimes also that root flare can also depend when you've planted a tree, of if you've planted it at the proper depth too. Because of course, when you plant a tree or a shrub, you don't want it to be too high, you don't want it to be too low. You want that when you've planted it from a container, the soil levels to match. Because if it's too deep, it's going to be in a pit that just has water, sits in there, almost creates a little mini wetland. And if it's too high, it's going to be exposed, roots are going to be exposed. So ideally, you want see the whole trunk, a little bit of root flare at the bottom, and mulch around it so it can just at least retain some moisture. And thinking of water conservation during your drought conditions. So, we all obviously want to reduce our effects on our water bill, but on the water table. So using things like rain barrels is really effective during drought conditions. And especially, you'd be surprised how fast a rain barrel can fill up in a small rain event, but then how fast you can suck one down even in not dry conditions as well. So sometimes one rain barrel might give you enough for a week or so, but if you've got 3-4 weeks of drought, you might consider having more than one rain barrel on your property. But things like this are really important for conservation of your water. Choosing the right plants for your hardiness zone. So of course, we want all the plants that we've planted to withstand winter as well. So we had this really, really cold winter this year. And so you want the plants that you've planted to be able to withstand the hardiness zone you've chosen. So this is not only to help build resilience for your plant to be able to withstand overwintering, but if your plant gets stressed, even on a moderate winter, it's not going to be able to withstand drought during the growing season. It's kind of that 1-2 punch effect. You want this plant to be able to withstand any and all things that can be thrown at it. And then when you're choosing plants, try to consider choosing things that, like an individual species that can tolerate variable moisture and sunlight levels. So we have some plants that grow in multiple plant communities and ecosystems. One plant might grow in dry prairies and mesic prairies. So you might have a moderate garden at home, what I could say is a mesic prairie. But if you've planted that plant that also grows in dry prairies during drought conditions, it should grow and thrive just fine. And same with plants, there's plants that grow in full sun and part shade. So if you get these plants that can be able to withstand multiple and variable moisture and sunlight levels, they can withstand a lot more of these drought and disease conditions that can possibly be coming their way. So prairies especially, a lot of these plants have very, very deep root systems. So I would say a majority of prairie species are adapted to withstanding drought conditions. Especially we have plants in the Silphium family that have roots that go down 16 to 20 feet. So even during really heavy drought conditions, they have their roots almost all the way down in the aquifer and water table. So I developed kind of a list of plants that not only are good for growing in dry prairies in our area, but these are also plants that are somewhat readily available at nurseries. So, I've looked my wife and I were kind of looking over developing these lists, and it's like, oh, you have all these plants that would do well, but not necessarily available through nurseries and be able to buy them. So they might be things us through Citizens for Conservation we can collect seed from and use in our restoration projects, but they're just not species often that are available through the traditional nursery trade. So this is a few slides of the Forbes, so this is just kind of the beginning. I'll give some time for folks to be able to take some photos, and then I included just a picture of some of the plants that are on here. So this is purple prairie clover. And when you're planting these too, you also want to be aware of any of the additional pressures the plants might be getting besides drought, whether it's pests like deer, rabbits. Are you planting them near the roadside where they might be subjected to salt issues? So some of these things you might want to take into consideration. One nice thing, especially when you're doing your research on these plants, a really, really good resource is Prairie Moon Nursery. Even though they're based out of Minnesota, you might find a variety of species that aren't necessarily native to Illinois, but they're a fantastic resource for native plant knowledge. And so when you're looking at the plants on there, they have several filtering mechanisms to find the plants that you want. But then each plant sometimes will list, is it resistant to deer? Is it good for home gardens? So you want to look at these little additional key factors about it to see if the plants you're planting are appropriate not only for your sunlight and moisture levels, but all these other factors that we all have in the urban landscape. And this is one of our goldenrod species we have in our area. This is specifically showy goldenrod. So I mentioned briefly and touched on the Silphium family, which two of them on here listed are rosinweed and compass plant. Another good one is prairie dock. The fun thing about those specific species, as I mentioned, they have root systems that are 16 to 20 feet deep. So they're oftentimes getting water drawn right from the aquifer and water table. And if you go up to them in the middle of summer, it could be 90 degrees out. And especially the plants like prairie dock and compass plant have very, very large leaves and you can go up and hold them between the two of your hands, and you can actually feel the temperature difference between the ambient air and the plant because it's getting water from the water table. So it's like you touch the plant and you can actually feel the coolness of it. It's really fascinating. Nature at work, being able to build drought resilience. The plants I showed you up to this point, those were all wildflowers. There's grasses and sedges that grow in our area and really comprise the matrix of our plant communities, like prairies and wetlands. And so this is a great thing to have, as not only I like to use them for aesthetic reasons in a garden, because I think they blend well with wildflowers, especially you get grasses like the blue stems. This is big blue stem, little blue stem. They have beautiful fall color. So they're great for fall color, and they give the great winter appearance during the off season and dormant season, especially when you get snow on the ground. And so they're not only good at filling in gaps, they have deep roots, they're able to withstand weed pressure a little more than your forbs. But sometimes if you plant just wildflowers, they oftentimes will grow, bloom, and then they kind of don't have, they've built all this heavy mass into the flower head and they don't have a lot of support, and sometimes your wildflowers will be flopping over. And so these grasses help give that support as well for the wildflowers. So when you have grasses and flowers growing together, they really work harmoniously together, just like in nature. Here's some woodland species of forbs that are good for helping withstand drought. This red one is wild columbine. Some key factors when you're choosing your plant species too in your urban garden, sometimes you want to factor in whether you want tall plants or short plants. So a lot of our native plants can grow 6-7 feet tall. Sometimes you don't want that, depending where you're planting your garden at. So you have to take that into account when you're planting things. But it can become a little bit more challenging when you're in a woodland or a shade environment. Because as the growing season happens, these plants are each species is outcompeting each other for sunlight as the season goes on. Spring plants are all really short, even in prairies, and then the plants get taller as the growing season goes on so they can get the sunlight above those ones that were just a month early. This is especially the case in woodlands. The plants are almost all short in spring, and then when you come into summer and late summer, early fall, there's hardly any plants in a woodland that grow short that time of year. They're almost all relatively medium or tall. So sometimes if you're looking for those short growing species in a woodland environment, you might only have some maybe spring blooming plants. And so the challenge comes sometimes when you're trying to, ideally we want to build these diverse gardens with lots of different species. We want bloom throughout the season. We want to be able to supply food for insects throughout the growing season. But there are sometimes a gap in that flowering period, even though you really want it all year, but sometimes you just have to accept a gap. It's just kind of like the patience with native gardening and restoration. There are certain factors you can't overcome. You just have to kind of learn some patience when you're doing natural areas restoration. But then sometimes you have to have patience within the season, and even though things might look a little green, give it a month or two and suddenly you'll see that flush of color. And this is especially the case in wetlands. No matter what species you choose, you're going to get maybe a handful that bloom in May and early June that have some nice color. And then during June and July, wetlands are just green. There's hardly anything blooming in them. And then come late July, August, early September, they're colorful as you can imagine. So sometimes you get the, oh no, I don't have any colors in my wetland. Well, it's unfortunate, but you just at least have the plant communities thriving in itself in the ways you see the native plants grow underground more than they do above ground a lot of times, and that's why they're good at withstanding drought. So sometimes, and I always say, because they're very resilient, patience is the key too. Sometimes you plant things and it may look like it died, kicked the bucket, but again, it has that root stock and that energy reserves underground. So usually if I see a plant get stressed during one season, I don't condemn it right away. I wait till the following year. And sometimes you'll see that plant come back and you'll be like, oh, thankfully, at least I didn't go dig it up. There's some fern species that you can use that are good for dry conditions. There's not a lot. Most of them really like moist woodland environments, but here's at least a few that are good for drier conditions. Here's some of the grasses and sedges that are good in woodland environments. The really lovely one a lot of people use in restorations, and I think it's great in native gardens as well, is the Pennsylvania sedge. It creates almost like a carpet. So this picture I have on the slide is of Penn sedge, and so it doesn't grow taller than maybe 6-8 inches. It's very fine and wispy, and it almost if you looked at it from afar, it would look like lawn grass. So for some people that don't, I can't imagine many in this room or listening on Zoom, but there's some people that like that grass look, but there's ways you can use native plants and still get that look and effect. I will say keeping it that way isn't the same though, because when you've got a natural area, you're going to get seeds blow in, other plants move in, roots spread. It's not like you're mowing it and keeping that grass only. So this is a really fun species that I like to use, and so many other restorationists do as well, and native gardeners. Here's some canopy trees that I like to recommend, especially almost all oak species are so great for drought resilience. They're like a keystone species in many of our ecosystems. There's a lot of animals and insects that thrive on them. The plant communities under them thrive on them. You wouldn't have our native natural woodlands around here without oaks. Hickories kind of go hand in hand with that, but oaks are just that keystone species to our northeastern and many Midwestern woodland ecosystems. But here's a great list of different oaks that are native to our area, great at withstanding drought. They're beautiful, they look wonderful, they have the awesome fall color. So I can't ever not recommend oaks enough. And here's some other canopy trees that go well with oaks too. And many of these are really well adapted to urban landscapes as well. So sometimes you get these construction soils, heavily compacted soils, salt inundation from roadside. So these species are not only really good at withstanding drought, but a lot of our urban types of pressures as well. And this slide is one of my favorites. This is the bark of a mature hackberry tree. It has some very, very, very unique bark. When you look at it, it almost looks like a brain, just the way it kind of is shaped. In our area, when it comes to doing restoration work, and oftentimes many of you've seen or been involved in buckthorn cutting and burning, but when winter times, there's no leaves on the trees, so you have to identify a lot of trees via their twigs, buds, or their bark when they're mature. And so this is one of the really distinguishing ways of telling certain tree species apart, and this is one that stands apart from them all, is hackberry. Some evergreens that are good. These two are, I will say, pretty much our only evergreens that are actually native to our area, but there are cultivars of these that you can buy through the nursery trade, and it's good to do some research on them. There's too many varieties for me to even try to know myself, recommend, but at least do some research on ones that are deer resistant and somewhat drought tolerant. So where you buy these from, the places you buy them from, the nurseries, they'll be a great resource for helping sway you in the direction of wanting evergreens. Now, most of the native plants in our area are deciduous. They have beautiful flowers in May, spring. Then they produce fruit. They have fall color on them. But sometimes when we're removing buckthorn, you want to keep that privacy too as well. Plus, evergreens are great habitat for certain birds. They give some food and for wildlife in wintertime. So, it doesn't hurt to also include evergreens when you're deciding to put in tree species. All depends on the property, the space, and all your requirements, but these are some of my recommendations. And then there's small trees and shrubs that are you can get plants that are 12, 15 feet in diameter, 12, 15 feet high. These are great recommendations. I also think for buckthorn replacement, because there are great native shrubs that grow in our area. They're small though. Technically speaking, there's a bunch of plants that grow in our ecosystems that are somewhat smaller, like roses, lead plant. They're technically called shrubs, but they're so small in stature, I would not call them within a home garden landscape a shrub, because they're not going to give you that look that you want as far as having something that's substantial in size, grows year after year, bigger and bigger, but also can be something that gives you that privacy effect when you're trying to get rid of buckthorn. Several more species that I like to use. And then in picking variety too, building diversity within your landscape. Don't pick all of one species necessarily, because of course we have invading insects, diseases that come into our area. We've all seen the aftermath of the emerald ash borer, but we also have coming into our area new insects like the viburnum leaf beetle. So picking, not only if you want to choose viburnums, I love viburnums, they're really, really lovely species, but maybe planting more than one variety of viburnum, because then they can maybe withstand the pressure if you by chance get that bug on your property. Now, I've seen some people talk about it, they decimated all of their viburnums, and I've had other people planted and they didn't touch any. So it's highly, highly variable on your situation, but that's why I say plant diversity, plant multiple species, and you'll be able to withstand some of those pressures from whether it's drought, whether it's disease, whether it's insect pressure. And some more trees and shrubs here. Oh, I'm sorry. These first slide were ones that are tolerant to full or partial shade. And then you get some, whoops, go back. Some that are just more tolerant to heavier shade conditions. So shade in an urban landscape is challenging, especially when you have maple trees on your property. There's a lot of tree species in our natural areas that might be native to Illinois, but are not native to fire-dependent ecosystems, which is a majority of what we manage. There are these floodplain ecosystems, like along the Des Plaines River and Chicago River, where you get fire species that are not tolerant of fire, because of course the low-lying floodplains don't burn often, but majority of northeastern Illinois is dependent and sensitive and used to having fire within its ecosystem. So you get a lot of species that we might remove in natural areas because they aren't, locally native to that plant community or ecosystem. But then when we're working in urban landscapes, we have to value trees in a whole different way. What a black cherry tree or a maple that we might cut down in the woodlands, you're not going to really just be hacking down all your trees in your urban landscape. So you have to value, obviously, all the trees that you have on your property, especially the smaller your property. Every tree has value. So you have to work with what you have sometimes. And so sometimes you have, especially Norway maples, are really extraordinarily good at casting deep, deep amounts of shade. And maple trees have very shallow roots, so it's not easy to get things established under them. So that's what's good about having species that are a little more shade tolerant, especially when you're picking perennial plants for in these shady areas. That's really where ferns, grasses, and sedges have their advantage, because flowering plants require a lot of energy to create the flowers that they have, then produce fruit. They need a lot of energy to do that they get from the sun. And so when you have a lot of shade, it's very difficult to have flowering plants under there. Even if it grows and survives, you might not get a lot of flowers on it. So picking certain species, depending on how much shade you have, is really key. And sometimes it's challenging. You might plant things and it doesn't do all that well. So a lot of times when you're gardening, you have to be your own artist, and where you're choosing to plant things, you might move things around, and you're learning as you go. Certain things survive, certain things don't. But that's why, again, the idea of diversity and planting native plants is really, really helpful. The question you might ask, whether you're in the audience or on Zoom, is where can I get these native plants? Well, of course, my first and foremost place to point people are your local native plant sales. So Peggy touched on the CFC plant sale that we have in spring. We also have a tree and shrub sale in fall. But there's also the forest preserves and wild ones in our areas also have native plant sales. So if you're not nearby one, there's one you could go to somewhere else. Sometimes you might be able to find different plant varieties. And sometimes they're online sales and they're in-person sales are on different dates. So maybe when you want to go to the CFC plant sale in person, you're out of town, and so you might be able to go to one of these others. And then there are retail nurseries. So some of the nurseries, native plant nurseries we have around here, a lot of them are really big operations, and some of them are pretty far from where we are, maybe an hour and a half drive, but then they also only supply to wholesale customers. So that's why I made this list of places that are available as retail nurseries. So folks such as yourselves can go pick out and buy plants. One of them not listed on here is Midwest Ground Covers. They're out of St. Charles. They're one of our best native plant suppliers in the area. We get them for as a supplier for our native plant sales. But since they don't necessarily sell to the public, they also sell their natural garden natives through other retailers. So sometimes you want to look for, if you're at just like Platte Hill or some of these others, I think if you go on Midwest Ground Cover's website, they tell you who they distribute through. And so you go there and you look for these branded natural garden natives, and you're buying really great natives that are grown locally, free of neonicotinoids. Of course, you can buy native plants from different home garden centers, but you don't know the history of whether it's been treated with systemic pesticides, which can in turn be detrimental to the insects we're trying to bring and thrive within your native garden landscape. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for listening to me and talk about native plants. I could talk all day, every day about native plants in different ways, but I was asked to kind of touch on drought resilience because, of course, with our climate change happening nowadays, there's a lot of factors you have to take into consideration when you're choosing what plants you want. We have species from south, moving more north, and so there's a lot of changes and things you have to be mindful of. And so thank you very much, everyone. So I'll open the floor up to questions, and let me ask, in person, Zoom, how would you like to do that, one and the other?
Let's do a little of both. I opened it up to the folks on Zoom a few minutes ago and nobody's come up with anything yet. But let's go ahead and stop sharing so people on Zoom can see what's going on in the room. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Matt, I just wanted to actually make a comment, not a question, but when you were talking about resources for native plants, CFC has a great resource on our website. It's our native plant database, and you can filter by the characteristics that you were talking about: shade, sun, tolerance to deer, tolerance to black walnuts, amount of water it requires. And we do that for trees and shrubs and grasses and things like that too. So even when we're not actually doing our plant sale, you can look at the native plant database. So if you just need to replace a shrub that died or a tree that, isn't going to make it, you can look at that to see what we say about them too.
Thank you for sharing it. Mm-hmm.
And I'll make a plug for the library's seed garden, which is open right now over by the staircase. A lot went in our first day, but there are still some plants there and there are some natives there as well.
And I just want to follow up Susan's comment and let people that may not know, the CFC plants, that spring plant sale did over 25,000 plants last year. So you get a good selection.
I have a question about Red Buffalo Nursery. The last I checked with them, he stopped.
Hold on. Was that you? I'm sorry.
She's got it.
Okay.
The last I checked, he had stopped selling to the public. Is he opened up public
I
sales
don't,
again?
I can't say I follow up on the list I have regularly. So it's good to get feedback from people when I see that. So I will follow up on that and check and remove it from my list if they're no longer selling to the public. So
I mean, he's selling to groups and whatnot, but he stopped selling to the public.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Ah.
Oh, okay.
Good to know. Thank you for sharing.
Okay. I know you said to plant a variety of viburnums, but is there a specific variety that is resistant to the viburnum leaf beetle?
I don't know them off the top of my head. There are wonderful resources online, especially through the university extension offices. I know if you just Google viburnum leaf beetle, I've seen like a list, because it's not specific to just the viburnums we grow in northeastern Illinois, because there may be 6 to 8 of them. I've seen online a list of probably 20, 30 different viburnums on some resource. I don't remember where, but it said like more susceptible, less susceptible, and least susceptible to viburnum. So they somebody has categorized ones that are less risk to the viburnum leaf beetle. I can't say I know which ones those are or the resource, but I know through other presentations I've given, and so I know when you share the link for the presentation here, I've also given resources out to share with people. So if I find that one, I will share it with folks.
Okay, I really love them. People have them that really bloom. Well, mine keep getting the leaf beetle and they're destroyed,
Oh,
so.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah. I do have a comment/question from someone on Zoom. Would love to see more pictures of Matt's work to get ideas for the home garden. Do you have any of those on your website? Do you show examples of?
There are some on our website. It's when trying to find some pictures for these gardens, and some we've had, it's like you plant the garden. So here, I'll go back to my presentation real quick to show you at least the one photo from my garden that can give you a bit of an idea. Back up some.
Yeah.
Just one moment, please. So it's like, when you're doing marketing, you could take 100 pictures and you're trying to find that, you can take 100 and you find 2 that are good. And so even though we've planted gardens, finding ones at the right time of year with nice photos, or if they're established yet, because even if we've planted gardens, it can sometimes be 4 to 5 years before, like these are both the same garden in the front of my house in Streamwood. And so this is showing an example of what it's like, we've planted it. It might have been a couple years, plants are growing, but because we didn't plant things 2 inches apart from each other, it's going to take time to kind of fill in the gaps between them. So then when you see on the right there, it's a number of years later where it's filled in. So the one picture I showed at the very beginning of my presentation was one of the better gardens that we've planted. I last year, I went around to several gardens we planted, and I went to one and it was like, oh, things aren't blooming yet. I went to another and like, oh yeah, something's blooming. And then the other one's like, it's not quite filled in yet. So yes, there are a couple examples on our website, but it's hard to get that real nice picture we're looking for until even in like prairie restoration, you're trying to get these pictures of a beautiful prairie. You might not get that beautiful picture till 10 years after you've started prairie restoration, because you take that picture, from far away, you're like, wow, there's a lot of plants, but you walk up close and you're like, there's a lot of bare space in between these plants. So yes, you can look at our website, woodsthewetlands.com, and see, I think there's a couple of examples that we have on there, but as I mentioned before, I'll put together some resources, not only native plant lists, a few pictures, and some links to different things that I think are great resources for basically everybody I talk to about native gardens. These things that I think are very helpful.
Right. Can you address the issue? Closer? The issue of, for those of us that are trying to get rid of the buckthorn on our property, about how long does it take
before you can start planting? Because I understand it has a chemical that goes through every part of the plant, plus its seed. It's allelopathic.
Mm-hmm.
And stated that you should give it time that the soil can deplete this chemical. Do you have an idea? I mean, do you wash it out yourself or do you put soap on it?
No, and you know, when I've experienced restoration, whether in a natural area or in an urban landscape, you know, and you're removing buckthorn, we don't really, I've never myself nor have heard any other land managers take into account a time frame of when to let those chemicals break down. The most important thing is when you're dealing with any invasive species is follow-up. So when you're dealing with a monoculture like buckthorn or wetland invasives like reed canary grass, Phragmites, you're wiping it out right away. You know, you're cutting and slashing it, you're coming on and you deal with bare soil right away. So you're starting with a clean slate, but then you're gonna have to do follow-up for a couple of years to manage resprouts, seedlings that come in the soil that are there. So then you at least have to you do the removal on one season, and then you're gonna have to spend at least 2 to 5 years treating buckthorn resprouts and seedlings with herbicide, pulling whatever. So at a minimum, you're not gonna wanna plant things until maybe 2 to 3 years after you've removed buckthorn, just so you can get that follow-up working. Because who wants to go spraying herbicide right next to something sensitive they've planted, you know, and putting that plant at risk. So there's that time frame of having to wait to do the follow-up. And then, you know, also as restorators, we're putting seeds, we're putting plants in there. And so I can't say for sure. I've seen like, oh, you know, we seed things and you're like, oh, it's not doing all that well. Like you see that from time to time, but usually you put the seeds down and you wait a couple of years and it comes up. But so I don't personally know if there's an exact time frame for waiting for those allelopathic chemicals to break down. But if you're giving it 2 to 3 years to do the follow-up work, that's probably a decent amount of time for rainfall to wash it through the soil and for it to naturally break down through its half-life cycle. Does that help answer your question?
Thanks.
It was a goldenrod species. So the photo I had shown was, so that time of year is more in late season. So that's where not only you saw the species that were a little bit taller, but you're seeing the colors of asters and goldenrods. So this is something that's, yes, this is showy goldenrod. And then I think sky blue aster, if I'm not mistaken, or smooth blue aster. So, you know, you get plants a lot of times from nurseries that are growing in spring and summer, but you get the real late summer, early fall that sometimes you don't get a lot of color out of. And that's where these asters and goldenrods fit the bill. They're perfect for that time of year. But at the same time, there's a double-edged sword to that. And when you're picking out plants, I don't think any of our resources show this, of whether the seeds on the plants are distributed by blowing through the wind or if they just drop in place through gravity. Because you might be trying to plant this formal garden in a urban landscape, and you're planting plants. You maybe decide you've done this planting plan. You want everything to stay where it is, but being native plants, they're going to move, they're going to migrate. But especially plants like these goldenrods and asters, the seeds blow in the wind, so they're going to end up almost anywhere. It could be the neighbor's yard, could be the garden you didn't plant with natives. So sometimes you want to have that taken into account too, but it's hard to know that without personal knowledge of the native plants, because they don't list that on those native plant resources, how the seed is distributed. So something to take into account when you're planting plants. But what's mist flower? Yeah, I was heard that one. And then another one is a vine, a clematis vine. It's native in our area, but the seeds blow in the wind. So being that it's a little vine, you know, you might have planted on some trellis somewhere, but then you'll find it around a tree, a shrub, your fence, and something will be all over your property wherever it can spiral and grow. So Yeah, it's challenging sometimes. And I didn't include it on here, but I'll include in the resources. I usually, when I do native garden design, I have a slide of plants to like caution using, because they're great in natural areas when you've got either native. They're great when you have 10 acres of space to work with. But when you got a small garden, you suddenly don't want to plant 10 species, and then you've got one species growing in abundance. So I have a nice list of resources of plants that are worth either avoiding or cautioning when you plant them. So I'll share that as well. Any other questions? Yes, spreads through its roots. Makes a great ground cover if you want that.
Can I just make another plug for the native plant database?
Please.
Susan got my brain going. So there is a couple more fun things about our native plant database. We have a person I know created a list of plant associates that grow under shrubs and trees. So if you look up, let's say, white oaks, there's a list of plants that are found historically under that species of tree. So you can kind of plant your own garden that would be reflecting what naturally grew in this region for all of time. And then also there are photos of leaves and leaf groupings on trees and shrubs to help you identify what is growing in your own yard. So just heads up about that.
Thank you. It's nice to have like-minded conservation folks in the audience. We can all share information with each other. So thank you for that.
I've often thought that the big blue stem, also known as turkey foot, would make a nice backdrop, but that thing, it has a lot of seeds that can blow around, and the roots even. Is it possible to like box them in so that, you can contain them in the area that you want the privacy?
Yes, I mean, that really all depends on how your landscape is and how you build your area. You see a lot of people use taller ornamental grasses when they're trying to hide a utility box. And then oftentimes you see these in like little small circles where you might see the utility box, ornamental grasses around it, and then mowed turf grass. So being that it's, big blue stem is one that is great, beautiful, but extremely aggressive in how it spreads through its seeds. And then it's tall, so it's very aggressive in how it shades and competes against other things. But if you've got this area that's being maintained by, let's say, a mower and turf grass, and it's very well contained, I think it's a perfect spot for something like that. It's just a matter, again, the seeds aren't necessarily blown through the wind. They drop, and birds probably feast on them and move them, but they don't have the fluff to carry them through the wind. They're grasses. They mostly just drop in place. So it's very situational on where you can use some of these aggressive plants and then where you can't. So every landscape is going to be different. So I think it's useful in so many different places, but you just have to know, can it stay where it is and play nice with others? It seems like that's all. Well, thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.